For millions of Americans, addiction didn't begin on the streets. It began in a doctor's office. There's a high chance you know someone who's a victim of this. The initial version of this medication had a noble purpose: to treat extreme chronic cancer pain and severe post-operative pain. But it had just one silly problem. Its patent was approaching expiration. The owners knew generic manufacturers would eat up their profits, and they had to do something to stop this. So they did. They created the most pathetic addiction crisis in America. The whole point of the medicine was to suppress pain, something that your body is already a master of. Humans have a remarkable built-in pain system. Scattered through your skin, muscles, and organs are specialized nerve endings called nociceptors. Their entire job is to detect damage, heat, pressure, chemical irritation, tissue injury, and convert that damage into an electrical signal. That signal travels up through the spinal cord. They enter into the brainstem through a relay station called the thalamus, and finally into the cortex, where it gets interpreted as what we call pain. But the beauty of this system lies in our natural painkillers. It's something you might have already faced, but never knew behind-the-scenes reality going on in your body. You might have faced an injury in an emergency, or at least heard of a soldier who kept running on an injured leg during a mission and only felt the pain later once the danger had passed. The reason behind this miracle is our survival mechanics. Your body doesn't just send pain signals unfiltered. It also has brakes. When you're injured, your brain releases its own natural painkillers, endorphins and enkephalins. It dampens that signal right at the synapse, the tiny gap between two nerve cells. The body has a built-in volume dial. That volume dial works because of a surprising thing called lock and key system. Nerve cells are studded with proteins called opioid receptors, kappa and delta receptors, and your endorphins are shaped exactly to fit into them, like a key built for a specific lock. That's the natural system. It's precise, self-regulating, and for most of human history, it worked without anyone needing to understand the chemistry behind this lock and key system. But then came a counterfeit key. It wasn't just to make profits, but to pull humans out of a hell even their own bodies couldn't escape. While the body produces its own natural painkillers, that system has strict biological limits that make it incapable of handling severe, ongoing physical pain on its own. So when a serious injury occurs, like breaking a bone or sustaining a wound, endorphins flood the system to keep you mobile for minutes to a few hours so you can escape danger. But once the immediate threat passes, the brain quickly breaks down those endorphins. The body turns the pain back on because pain serves a biological purpose. It forces you to protect the injured area, rest, and avoid further damage while tissues heal. Sounds like a defensive system, but in extreme cases, this becomes a nightmare. The brain only produces endorphins in tiny microdoses. So when faced with severe extreme tissue damage, like major surgical incisions, shattered bones, advanced cancer, or severe nerve damage, the amount of pain signals firing up the spinal cord exceeds the amount of natural endorphins the brain can produce by a vast number. Without external relief, patients experiencing severe acute or chronic pain can suffer from traumatic levels of distress, high blood pressure, sleep deprivation, and shock. The cure for it was a weird thing: dangerous drugs. For most of the 20th century, doctors treated opioids like morphine with real caution. They knew these drugs were chemically tied to the opium poppy, and earlier generations of physicians had already watched addiction epidemics unfold. Morphine addiction after the American Civil War being one well-known example. To avoid such disasters, strong opioids were reserved almost exclusively for two situations: patients dying of terminal cancer and patients recovering from major surgery. Short windows, closely supervised. For everyday chronic pain, a bad back, arthritis, an old sports injury, doctors reached for aspirin or ibuprofen, specifically because they were weighing the risk against benefit and choosing caution. But as science progressed, we found a miracle drug to suppress pain, or at least that was the case initially. It's a single molecule, 18 carbon atoms, 21 hydrogen atoms, 1 nitrogen atom, and 4 oxygen atoms, arranged in one very specific shape. It is written like this, and most people call it oxycodone. This molecule doesn't heal anything. It doesn't touch the torn muscle, the broken bone, or the surgical incision. In fact, it never goes near the injury at all. Instead, it travels straight to the brain and it flips off the brain's own alarm system. The beginnings were insanely noble, but then the poison called greed destroyed millions of lives. The company who grew this empire was Purdue Pharma, and the family behind it was the Sacklers. Physician brothers Raymond and Mortimer Sackler bought a small drug company called Purdue Frederick back in 1952. In 1984, Purdue released MS-Contin. It was a controlled-release morphine pill that became a major success for treating cancer pain. But by the late 1980s, MS-Contin's patent was approaching expiration, which meant cheaper generic competitors were about to eat into as much as $400 million a year in revenue. So Richard Sackler, Raymond's son, came up with a wild idea. Pushed the company to solve that problem by taking its existing slow-release coating technology, a formula called Contin, developed by a Sackler-owned lab in the UK. They applied the formula to a different, far more potent molecule, oxycodone. Oxycodone itself wasn't new. It was first synthesized in Germany back in 1916, derived from the bane, a naturally occurring compound in the opium poppy. In pharmacology terms, it's what's called a semi-synthetic opioid. Nature provides the starting raw material and a chemist modifies it in the lab. Heroin, notably, belongs to that same broad category, derived the same way from morphine. Purdue combined oxy from oxycodone with Contin from its slow-release coating, and in December of 1995, the FDA approved America's nightmare medicine, OxyContin. It hit the market in 1996, and how it functioned was scary. The oxycodone wasn't just sitting inside a shell, it was embedded throughout a solid wax and polymer matrix that dissolved gradually as it moved through the stomach and intestines. It released small doses of the drug over roughly 12 hours instead of the 4 to 6 hours of an ordinary instant-release pill. And the logic Purdue built its entire marketing campaign around was this: if the drug enters the bloodstream slowly, there's no sharp spike in blood concentration. No spike means no intense rush. And no rush means a dramatically lower risk of triggering the addiction pathways in the brain, at least in theory. That claim didn't stay in a marketing brochure. It made its way onto the actual hijacked FDA-approved label in exactly these words: delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. Sit with that word for a second. Believed. Not proven, not demonstrated in long-term trials. It was a theoretical inference written onto a federal safety label, and it gave that inference the appearance of settled scientific fact. But why did I say FDA was hijacked? Well, because it actually was. To understand why the approval was so dangerous, we need to understand down to what oxycodone is actually doing inside a neuron. As a pill, oxycodone is absorbed unusually well for an opioid. Somewhere between 60 and 87% of an oral dose actually reaches the bloodstream. This is roughly 3 times the bioavailability of oral morphine. It's small and fat-soluble enough to cross the blood-brain barrier efficiently. Once inside the brain, it binds primarily to those mu opioid receptors we talked about earlier, the same lock designed for your body's natural endorphins. But this key is synthetic, far more potent, and arrives in a dose your body never intended to produce on its own. Those mu receptors are what's called G-protein coupled receptors. When oxycodone locks into one, it triggers a chemical cascade inside the cell. It swaps out one molecule for another on the receptor's internal machinery, which then inhibits an enzyme called adenylate cyclase. It lowers levels of a signaling molecule called cyclic AMP. The net effect is that the neuron becomes less excitable. It fires less, and it releases less of the neurotransmitters, like substance P, that would normally carry a pain signal forward. That is the literal molecular mechanism behind turning down the alarm. But there's a second, entirely weird effect happening at the same time. It happens in a brain region called the nucleus accumbens. Mu receptor activation there triggers a flood of dopamine. This is the same reward circuitry that lights up for food, for connection, for anything evolution decided was worth repeating. Oxycodone hijacks that circuit directly and artificially, which is the biological root of why it's not just pain relieving but powerfully reinforcing. The medicine was made for everyone except genetics had other plans. Your liver processes oxycodone through two separate enzyme pathways. One, called CYP3A4, converts most of it into a largely inactive metabolite called noroxycodone, but a smaller portion goes through a different enzyme, CYP2D6, which converts oxycodone into oxymorphone, a metabolite with an even higher affinity for the mu receptor than oxycodone itself. And roughly 10% of the population carries a genetic variant that makes this second pathway much less active, which means the exact same pill at the exact same dose can hit two different people's brains with meaningfully different intensity, purely because of a genetic dice roll baked into their liver enzymes. But that's not a flaw in how the drug was marketed, that's just the chemistry. This critical drug rested not on testing or R&D, but on one stupid assumption, the one that caused the disaster. Purdue's whole reduced abuse liability claim rested on one unstated assumption, that patients would swallow the tablet whole. But the 12-hour release mechanism lived entirely in the tablet's physical structure, the wax and polymer matrix, not in the chemistry of the drug itself. So it was a mechanical barrier, not a biological one. And mechanical barriers can be broken. Crushing, chewing, or dissolving the tablet destroyed that barrier instantly, releasing the entire 12-hour payload of oxycodone all at once. The result was exactly the sharp, intense rush the slow-release design was supposed to prevent. And when people snorted or injected the crush powder, they were getting, in effect, researchers and users alike compared directly to injecting heroin. By the early 2000s, this method of abuse was documented in both medical literature and major investigative journalism. But the pill's design and marketing continued largely unchanged for years afterward. But then who approved this horrible thing? Seems like they ignored the details, or at least pretended they did. Dr. Curtis Wright IV was FDA's medical review officer responsible for OxyContin's new drug application. In December 1995, Wright signed off on the approval, including that believed to reduce abuse liability language, despite there being no long-term clinical trials to actually support it. He left the FDA around 1996 to 1997, took a brief position at a different pharmaceutical company, and then, in 1998, a suspicious incident happened. Roughly 2 to 3 years after approving OxyContin, Dr. Curtis was hired by Purdue Pharma as Executive Director of Medical Research. He was hired at a compensation package reported around 3 times his previous government salary. This weird thing has a term. It's known as regulatory capture when the people responsible for overseeing an industry come from, or go on to work for, the very companies they're supposed to be watching. To be precise about it, Wright stated under oath that he never discussed a job with Purdue while he was still at the FDA, and he was never charged with a crime. So this is a well-documented and controversial story, but there's no proof that he deliberately made a deal with Purdue. Fair point, right? But this was just a base-level problem. What turned it into a disaster was their dangerously genius tactic. With the label secured, Purdue built a sales machine to match it. Rather than targeting pain specialists, the company focused on general practitioners and family doctors, physicians who wrote enormous volumes of everyday prescriptions but often had little to no specialized training in addiction medicine. Purdue expanded its sales force from 318 representatives in 1996 to 671 by the year 2000, more than doubling in 4 years. So did it work? Well, sales climbed from about $48 million in 1996 to nearly $1.1 billion by 2000. The secret wasn't a higher number of salespeople. It was a demonic strategy they were using to pour in monstrous sales. Purdue built what internal documents called a super core targeting system. They purchased prescription data to identify the highest volume opioid prescribers by name and territory, then poured promotional spending, free meals, gifts, and all expenses paid trips to pain management seminars disproportionately toward those doctors. Sales representatives' bonuses were tied directly to prescription volume and dosage strength in their territory, not patient outcomes. In 2001 alone, Purdue paid out roughly $40 million in sales bonuses. But the message those people were trained to deliver, word for word, was that the risk of addiction was less than 1%. This was just the first pillar of deception. Purdue also funded and worked alongside advocacy groups, most notably the American Pain Society. It promoted a campaign urging doctors to treat pain as the fifth vital sign, right alongside pulse, blood pressure, temperature, and respiration rate. Once pain became a numerically scored, mandatory metric that doctors were expected to document and address at every single visit. So undertreating it started to look like poor patient care, or even malpractice. Hospital accreditation standards and some doctor performance metrics began incorporating pain score responsiveness, which meant this wasn't just individual doctors making individual choices anymore. It was an entire professional standard shifting system-wide, which is exactly why the effects were so widespread and so long-lasting. But the height of shamelessness was seen after many people started showing addiction symptoms. As people started showing addiction behavior and started seeking out more pills, requesting increased doses and getting upset when their prescription ran out, some doctors became concerned and started thinking about reducing the dose. In response, Purdue-aligned medical literature promoted a new clinical concept, pseudo-addiction. The idea was that these behaviors weren't actually signs of addiction at all, but signs of undertreated pain, meaning the correct response wasn't to reduce the dose, but to increase it. The unsatisfying consequences for the company finally arrived. In May 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 senior executives pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges of misbranding OxyContin, falsely claiming it was less addictive and less prone to abuse than competing opioids. The fine was more than $600 million, one of the largest ever levied against a pharmaceutical company at the time. It might seem huge, but a larger picture had a completely different story. If you put these numbers next to the $35 billion plus OxyContin would go on to generate in total revenue, the fine was just less than 2% of the drug's lifetime earnings. So it was a cost easily absorbed by an enormously profitable product. But as time passed, mounting pressure forced Purdue to come up with a different version. It was less addictive and was supposed to solve the problem. But the improved version became the reason millions of Americans are addicts today. In 2010, facing mounting pressure, Purdue released a reformulated, abuse-deterrent version of OxyContin. It was engineered so that crushing it produced a gummy, gel-like substance that resisted snorting or injection. This genuinely made the pill harder to misuse in its most dangerous forms. But by 2010, millions of Americans were already physically dependent on oxycodone, and reformulating the pill did nothing to reduce their underlying tolerance or withdrawal risk. It just made their existing supply harder and more expensive to obtain. So the deadliest thing followed. Many of them turned to a cheaper, more available alternative that activates the exact same mu opioid receptors: heroin. This helped speed up the shift from prescription pills to heroin, alongside wider crackdowns on opioid prescribing. That shift eventually opened the door to an even deadlier drug, illicit fentanyl. It's a synthetic opioid that can be up to 50 times more potent than heroin and is now a major driver of US overdose deaths. Thousands of Americans faced the wrath of this negligence, and so did the founders of this drug. As lawsuits piled up, more than 2,600 federal and state suits followed since 2007. The Sackler family withdrew roughly $11 billion from Purdue between 2008 and 2018, moving it into family trusts and offshore holding structures. It was largely out of reach of future US civil judgments. In September 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but it was the company that filed, not the Sackler family members personally, who by then were no longer Purdue employees, at least on paper. In 2020, Purdue pleaded guilty a second time to federal criminal charges. This time, it was for conspiracy to defraud the United States and violate anti-kickback laws as part of an $8.3 billion resolution. The Sackler family separately agreed to pay $225 million in a civil settlement without admitting personal criminal wrongdoing. In 2021, a bankruptcy court approved a plan that granted Sackler family members broad civil legal immunity from future opioid lawsuits in exchange for their financial contribution, even though the family members themselves were never personally insolvent. Seemed like a relief, but the US court had a brutal plan. In June 2024, the US Supreme Court struck down that plan in a 5-4 ruling. It decided that bankruptcy law doesn't allow blanket immunity to be granted to non-bankrupt third parties, the Sacklers, without the consent of every individual claimant. The entire case was sent back to the negotiating table. Then the hefty numbers surfaced. What emerged in January 2025 was a new settlement in principle worth $7.4 billion. Sackler family members agreed to contribute up to $6.5 billion over 15 years, while the restructured Purdue entity would contribute roughly $900 million. Crucially, the new deal fixed the problem the Supreme Court identified. Creditors and victims could now individually opt out of releasing their right to sue Sackler family members directly. The Sacklers permanently lost ownership and control of Purdue and were barred from selling opioids in the United States, with a new entity governed by a board tied to the settling states taking over. On November 18, 2025, U.S. bankruptcy judge Sean Lane formally approved the plan. It was approved after more than 99% of voting creditors supported it, noting that it resolved claims connected to an estimated 900,000 opioid-related deaths since 1999. Victims then finally saw a ray of hope. Victim payouts are set to begin in 2026, with qualifying individual claimants able to receive anywhere between $8,000 and $16,000. But investigative reporting from ProPublica found that many opioid victims are being excluded from compensation entirely due to eligibility criteria that were narrowed and changed late in the 2025 claims process, which is not a triumphant ending. It's a genuinely unresolved one. But does money solve their problem? 900,000 are dead in the US since 1999 and later, and over 5 million Americans are still living with an opioid use disorder, and you start to realize Purdue didn't just light a match. They lit one, walked away, and let it burn for 30 years. Disasters like Purdue have happened several times. Sometimes the outcome is addiction. Sometimes it's stealing your IQ. The culprit that did it was gasoline, but how it did this video has the answer for it.